And welcome to Friday Afternoon at the Manor, broadcasting from Manor Road Church. And my name is John Joseph Massandrea, and ready to introduce our wonderful host, Susan Johnson.
Okay. So, hello everyone, thank you for joining us. We are happy to introduce, come on, friend, behave, Jill Fendelman, who is an award-winning filmmaker who has come up with several works, but the one we're going to focus on today is Man on Fire, which deals with Charles Moore, who was a minister down in Texas, who set himself on fire to protest the intense racism of his country, of his state, much like the Buddhist monk did back in Vietnam in the 60s. And so this sounds very intriguing. So thank you, John.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. It's great to see how technology has really stepped in those last years. I mean, this is pretty awesome. So I guess I'll give a little brief of how I got to this point, and then I can talk about the creation of Man on Fire and that film and where it's gone and the effects it's had. So I grew up in Miami. My father had an art cinema, Coconut Grove. I went there. I first got into filmmaking. I went to Savannah, Georgia for undergrad, made a couple of feature films while living in New York City, made a film in Singapore, and then decided to go back to grad school, where I went to UT Austin. And so my thesis film ended up being Man on Fire. And I don't know if for all of you who've been to, if you've been to Texas or not, but Texas is kind of its own world in a way, and it's got a lot of intriguing culture. I think they want to succeed. It's, you know, that's always been a kind of a talk. Similar, maybe you might feel in Canada, where you have the, what is it, of Quebec or of the Ontario region. Correct me if I'm inaccurate in that. So Man on Fire was a journey for me in filmmaking, as I do in all my films, in wanting to learn about other worlds and learn about other people. And the whole idea in filmmaking is really to learn. I mean, I think in life in general is using these different vehicles. For me, it's film, it's art, to look as a mirror to I can help heal myself and find a deeper meaning in life, and get to a deeper place of growth spiritually, which I imagine you all will identify with. So I was in my third year at UT. I was looking for my thesis film to do, and a neighbor came up to me and said, a friend of mine, we became friendly, and said she had a friend who was from this small town in Grand Saline, which is East Texas. And in this town, it was about 2 years prior at this point, a preacher, a white preacher named Charles Moore, he was in his late 70s, I believe, decided to self-immolate, like the Tibetan monks, set himself on fire as a protest against racism in this small town. Now, this had happened, but it never really didn't make national news. Most people had not heard of it. And my friend, who then became, the man, James Chase Sanchez, who was her friend, who ended up being a producer on the film, was from this town. He was part Hispanic, from a town that was known to be primarily white and proud of it for most of history. And so his thesis, ironically, was also to explore this town and explore what that meant being from there. So we connected and decided to go on this journey. It's about 4 hours from Austin to the small town of Grand Saline. And imagine, town has 3,200 people. And there's like between 30 minutes away, there's another small town, but this is very rural East Texas, cowboy country, not where I grew up, which was Miami, in the city. So this is a whole new world. And I go there. I remember one of the first things someone saying is, "Oh, we got a foreigner over here." So it's really out of, my element, but also very fascinating to learn about. And so we went out there, and the journey began where we would interview people who either are from the town, some people who witnessed self-immolation, people who were from the surrounding town. And there was particularly two questions that I think every film starts with a question. The film starts with a question that the film then attempts to answer. And whether it fully answers is besides the point, just the attempting to answer and give the audience information. Ideally, I think in my perspective, what makes a good film gives the audience information and clues for them to make their own decision. So this film, Man on Fire, was about, first, why did this man set himself on fire in a small parking lot in front of a Dollar General where barely anyone saw? And then second, he claimed this town was racist, and he wanted I think the title of his letter that he left was Grand Saline, repent of your sins. He was a Methodist minister. Was this town racist? And what does that mean today? So in this journey of doing these interviews, it was also a journey for myself to learn, what does racism look like today? Because I grew up with that mentality of, okay, racism, especially in the States, is okay, 1960, before 1960s, pre-civil rights or during civil rights movement, explicit racist language, segregation, that's racism, right? Explicit racism. And I got to learn through the process of this how there's also something called implicit racism that is not as explicit, but exists so much, but it's much more nuanced. And then there's systematic racism, which is very prevalent. But as a white person, you don't really have to look at those things unless you're forced to or you choose to. And so it was interesting in doing these interviews and talking to town people. It's like, first, how are we going to talk about racism in small town, rural Texas? It's like, people are not going to want to talk to us. But my producer, being from the town, being a football player, which was a really big thing, or is a big thing in small town USA, it was an in where people would talk to us. And I realized you don't really need to ask people directly about racism. It's almost what people don't say or how they don't talk about something speaks just as much about even talking about something. And we had this vehicle of Charles Moore setting himself on fire in this town. And so that vehicle of, hey, what do you think about this person doing this? To in essence, commit suicide for a cause. And so that was our tool. That was our inciting incident in film terms, where we can talk to people about this. It was fascinating for me because people would say things that I didn't really understand were racist. So it was a journey for me in learning about this. And thankfully, having my producing partner, James J. Sanchez, who was critical race theorist, so big term now, right? Critical race theory professor, and obviously being a person of color himself, could really talk about this in great length. What does it mean? Like when someone says, I don't see color, that's a lot of people say. Or you'll see in the film, for people who've seen it or are going to see it, someone would say, people have their own church. Black people have their own, they go there, we go here. What's the problem with that? Just little subtle nuances that would say, or someone would say, there's no more racism. We had a Black president, right? Barack Obama. He was the president at the time. So there's just little things you start to pick up and learn and see how people, or a white person saying, I don't see racism. I've lived here, I never see it. I just don't see it. But then you go to 20 miles out where Black people do live, because this town was known for Grand Saline for being an all-white town. and having these sundown town signs, which is a sign in front of towns at the entrance and the exit, or both entrances, saying don't let me see, with some expletive about like, don't let me see your Black people here, but much more harsh way of saying it, after sundown. And so those are all across the US, not just in the South, actually even more in the Midwest. But that was something this town was known for. It's known for being racist. And you see in the surrounding communities, African Americans talking about how they just won't go to that town. They'll jump over it if they could, because it was just known for. So it brings up this question about, and then these stories, these folklores about things that would happen to Black people there. And so the film explores, were these stories folk, or were they historical? And there's not enough proof to really to say they're historical, but everyone knows and they're repeated. And to this day, you have students and kids and children being taught these stories. And so what's the reason for that? Why are the racist stories continued to be passed on? Even if the town claims they're fake, there's something to be said there. Is it because we want to keep Black people out? Would be one train of thought. Or, I mean, I don't know. It's interesting, it's fascinating. So that was the exploration of the film and making that. And we went there for 7 trips over a year, or 6 trips over a year, and talked to people who would talk to us. We got to interview a few people who witnessed the actual self-immolation. And then we got to interview people. The other thread of this story was really learn about who Charles Moore was, this lifelong activist who in his late years in life wanted to use his life as a form of protest, which was very in line with his whole life, and do it in a way that is very, I mean, horrific in many ways, but it is a form of protest that is, you could say, arguably successful in history, especially, and it still happens today in Tibet, where they're protesting China, and I mean, it happens many times throughout the year. So it's a forum, and I guess we're here today because, and I'm here today and I've spoke, I want to say 100 times or more about this film and what it is talking about, the making of it and what it means, because Charles Moore did that. So it's interesting, but he did it in a place that there was no news coverage. It was a small town. I mean, it's just fascinating and baffles me. And I don't know what he thought. Maybe there'd be more press, or he thought there would be, I don't know. Sometimes maybe the act, we can't think about the results, and the act is, the value is within the act, and just know that the God will take it to where it needs to be. So yeah, I'd like to put out there, and I can keep talking about stories here and there, but I don't know, I mean, particularly if there's any particular questions, if you think, John Joseph, that might be good angles to take this with, or philosophize about.
Lots of questions.
Yeah.
I'm just going to just shift. There we go. Okay, great. We can both see each other at the same time. Good. And yeah. Good. Oh, isn't that good?
Hello.
The magic of I just learned something about Zoom platform. HPY, I didn't know you could do that. So Joel, yeah, lots of questions, but what I might do is for us to both have spotlight at the same time. That might be a good idea. And there you go. We're like side by side. That's good. So when you think of racism, because you touched a couple of things that really touched, that percolated my thoughts. When did you first become aware of racism? Or do you remember was there like a milestone moment for you, or was it just gradual?
I mean, I think I thought about it so much in terms of civil rights movement,
Yes.
race.
Yes.
So it was outside of me,
Yes. Okay.
something else. And then I grew up in a neighborhood that was, there was train tracks, and on the one side was white people, and the other side was Black people.
Yes.
And that's how it was. And you just didn't go, or when you drove through that side, you locked your doors. But it was just such a part of, I didn't think about it other than, oh, this is what life is. And
Right.
I didn't think of it. I thought of it as like an economic thing, like, oh, that's just, they tend to be poor. I just thought it was coincidence. And then I didn't really look into it more until actually more recently in my life. It's like, oh, wow, that was segregation in its form.
So yeah, I can certainly understand it. I guess for me, when I think of the series Roots, was a real turning point for me, becoming more aware. And I think you're younger than me. You may not remember Roots, but Roots was a mini series before there was a lot of them. And it's interesting nowadays. You probably talk about Roots in school, but of course now then it was. I watched it because it was on television. That's what I did. And for me, it helped me that slavery was wrong. I mean, basically came out of Roots, and that was a bad period of history. And also reminds me, as you were talking, when I was in high school, I had a friend who was from India, and her name was Rose Rodriguez. So she had sort of a Spanish-ish sounding name. And when we'd often study together. I remember bringing over to our house, but I told my dad she was Spanish. I didn't say she was from India, because I somehow I knew, I wouldn't have used the word racist. I knew my dad was prejudiced just by how he talked. And I remember that. But it's like I just saw people as they were. And but I still remember that. And I think, okay, later on I challenged my father on some of his perspectives, but then when you're a teenager, not as much. But you remind me of how powerful that can be. And you also think of this persona of this minister, and you think of what he did, and you remind us that he did this, but the media didn't pay attention. But you reminded me right away of another incident where a woman did something similar but different, and the media paid attention. It was the women's right for vote movement back in Britain, and it was because Mrs. Pankhurst threw herself in front of the horse of the king of the day, because the women's votes movement had no traction, and she wanted to have traction. And maybe that's a bit what the minister was trying to do. But now, because of your film, there's more traction.
Yeah, I still baffled as why he chose to do it in the parking lot in the small town. Because I think he actually was going to do it in Dallas. There's Southern Christian, I'm blanking on the name, but a big Christian university there that he went to.
Yeah.
And he was going to do it in there, and then it would have got major attention, and he decided not to. He felt he just didn't want to bring that sort of to the beautiful grounds. He wrote in a letter about it, why he didn't do it.
He was a very thoughtful person.
He was yeah.
But so it's interesting because you think of that.
I think you're muted right now, Bax.
Oh, okay. I wonder how.
Oh, now you're good.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Would you call him a secular Messiah?
Say that again. A what? A
secular Messiah.
Would I call him a secular Messiah? Is that what you're saying? I guess you have to, what does it mean to be a secular Messiah?
So I guess it's a concept I've heard a lot, but it made me, I'm become more aware of it in some of the films, in the fiction films, where the hero figure has a Messiah-ish, but it's not religious. It's more about a secular redemption, freeing people from a limited perspective, maybe from being less than and encountering something more than. And when I say secular, he wasn't trying to bring religion to people, but he was trying to bring to awareness of their internal racism by doing that, by doing what he did. And so in a sense, he's not talking about Jesus or anybody. He's talking about injustice.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I almost think that religion at its best is that, right? Just getting to
It
the
is.
core.
It is. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, religion was meant to point us towards how to transform society. Unfortunately, some religions focus. It was a bit like a navel gazing. Okay, now we're about all over the corner and forget about the rest of the world. But I mean, the core principle of the most sacred text is about us reaching out to the marginalized. Right. That's where we
Yeah.
lose confidence with that. No, no. And you mentioned racism. It's interesting. My husband is actually from Chicago, and when you talk about neighborhoods, when I first went to Chicago, he did the same thing. He talked about this black neighborhood, this Spanish neighborhood. And I said, hello, this is the most racist thing you're saying. We don't have that in Canada, but actually we do. Okay, not the same way. And our version of Texas would be Alberta. Okay, and but I've been to Texas. San Antonio is Texas redemption. Okay, have you been to San Antonio?
Briefly, yeah.
It's got culture and it's yeah.
Yeah. Well, Austin, too.
Well, yeah, but my perception sometimes of Texas is I'm big and I'm from Texas, but that's a
Yeah.
stereotype, unfortunately.
Yeah.
No, so, but then you have anti-racism. But then what encouraged you? You mentioned about film and stuff, but what encouraged you to get into film? To be a, I'm assuming you said you not only creative, you wrote it, you produced. I mean, this is quite amazing. You're the man who's like the Renaissance man of the film industry. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I first got into it, I didn't really know what I was getting into it. I knew that I liked film. I wanted to be an artist, or I liked art and making art and self-expression. And then as I started making more films, it is a tool for healing for me, because the films I make are films that represent blocks in myself. So my first film, which I think you'd find fascinating too, is David, about a Muslim boy and his friendship with Orthodox Jewish boys who think he's Jewish. And so it was me reconnecting with identity, or what does that mean to be, what separates us, and my own identity and my own blocks around that. And then making a film in Singapore about a Filipino migrant worker that looked at class and my own blocks and healing that need to look at class and things I didn't want to look at there. And then this one being about racism, my own racism that I wasn't so much so aware of, but now much more aware of and working on. So film is just a great, it's a tool, and it's a key to people and worlds that would not open up to you otherwise. So I can have a camera and have this context of, we're making a film, and all of a sudden I get access, or someone opens up in a way and talks about something that there would be no framework to really talk about that stuff. But we create a framework now, like, okay, I'll talk to you for an hour about this and my feelings about this and that, and explore this. And it's just amazing. It's such a tool. And then, so I think at the core of it, if I can make a film and find some healing in different parts of my life, if it's happening authentically for me, then I know it'll be happening for other people watching the film too, because we're all the same, right? We're all connected in different ways. So that's what's driving me now.
Well, it's interesting. You remind me of the film that was created many decades ago, Citizen Kane, which is really challenging society at the best.
Which film?
Citizen Kane. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. But when you look at the backstory, it's quite remarkable, because I mean, he was going on the edge, but it caused his entire career to be not as successful as it might have been. But yet it still stands, as much as they tried to bury it, as one of the most successful films in Hollywood. And you look at how they did some of the filming techniques, it was radical, quite radical. But when you think of, so when you think of your film in particular, because you've taken a story that was a quieter story, and now it's a bigger story. And when you think of racism, and racism, as you know, isn't singular to the US. And recently with the George Floyd has happened, and it's brought more awareness of racism, not only in the US, but also in Canada. And as you probably know, we've now discovered that we never learned this. We had slavery in Canada up until When the British Empire declared abolition of all slavery, that's 1830. That's pretty late on the time spectrum when you think about it. There were, in New France, they had slaves, and certainly and we recall the history of the country, 1776, well, all the loyal people to Britain went to Canada. Well, they also had slaves. Okay. But even though we had the Underground Railroad, we we like to think, well, we had a welcoming place, yes, but we did have that too, and we had our own version of segregation, though we didn't. There was a sign in the beaches of Toronto, 1920s. This is part of our history books. No Jews, dogs, or blacks allowed, which is horrific for Canada. But we never were taught that. Right? But now we are being taught that. Just like your film is causing people to take notice.
Yeah.
And become aware. Yeah. And in some ways, you're helping people experience a conversion, so to speak. We'll call it secular conversion, whatever that might be. I mean, now, have you found when you talk to people, because I'm assuming you must have gone to universities now, there's a sort of, I call it eureka moment. Oh, I didn't know.
I'd say a lot of times, well, the easy way to go and after watching the film is, wow, those people in Grand Saline are really racist. And that's really terrible what's going on in Grand Saline. And that's the easy low-hanging fruit to go to. And then the more difficult, and usually one or two people in the audience will go here and say, you know what, Grand Saline's kind of like this next town, or it's kind of like our town. And that's when it gets interesting, because that's really what we don't want Grand Saline to be a scapegoat. We want Grand Saline to be a mirror of where's the Grand Saline in our own town. Yeah. And then to go a little bit deeper, if someone really is open to it, where's the Grand Saline in me? Mm-hmm. And that's where we really get to it. How do I represent some of the things that I'm seeing in this film? How do I represent racism still today in my life, in my feelings?
It's interesting because we're certainly asking that question now, but you mentioned civil rights movement. And I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you think we were further ahead in the 1960s and somehow we got lulled into a false sense of, oh, we've arrived, we ticked that box, and then we actually went backwards as opposed to forwards? What's your sense of that?
I mean, it's hard to say because I wasn't born in, I wasn't, so I'm just looking at reflective media of the 1960s and hearing other people's stories of it.
Yes.
And obviously I have limited experience with racism myself. You look at some, it's crazy because you look at, I mean, some things you're like, well, there isn't explicit segregation like white people only stuff happening. But then you're looking at, well, you're looking at people are getting killed by the cops like George Floyd, and it's just because body cameras, they really seen a witness to it. And I was like, wow, did that really change? I mean, you get when someone particularly of color or an African American says stuff hasn't changed, like I could understand that. Yeah, I get that, because it doesn't feel like it when you see that through that lens.
So, yeah, I mean, because what I remember, I commented to somebody, I think what happened with the George Floyd piece and others is that now we have smartphones who can capture it. I think it was always happening, but there was no proof.
Exactly.
He said, we said, you said, they said. Now you can't, because you can't lie from a video. You can't. I mean, you see something, a physical action happening. I guess the key part is how do we, and like your film is a way to shift towards changing inside, to own whatever that racism is. Now you must be then doing talks and hoping at universities and other places that's happening. That's right.
Where people are talking about.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, people, they really get, when I've talked about the film literature, they didn't get too much into more about just the reflection on their own community, more so is where we'd get to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I watched the movie Mississippi Burning a couple of months ago, and if you've seen it,
Yes.
and I was so blown away by the rhetoric being so identical, especially with the politicians,
Oh, yeah.
and they had these little snippets that were, I don't know if they were real interviews of people in town or mock interviews, but how people would respond to that incident in Mississippi Burning, where the three activists were killed, was like so like today, like, oh my God, this could be made today with these same rhetoric, and it's exactly the same.
That's a key challenge, definitely. So do you see, have you been participating in study groups or panel discussions?
We've done, I mean, when I was doing more toying with the film, that sometimes at different screenings, there would be a panel discussion with different people from the community, usually one or two are all from the BIPOC community, and just a way, yeah, to have a dialogue to talk about this. And then obviously with COVID, it's been more Zoom and virtual screenings,
Yes.
but the film, yeah, it's still, I mean, it's still a tool, and it's also, I mean, it can be used many ways. One also is just, how do we look at protest? What is the efficacy of this type of protest? I think that gets sometimes, I don't say it's controversial, but people have different feelings about self-immolation as a form of protest, and was, if we use the, well, you could have done more if you stayed alive, and I don't know, it gets interesting. It's very complex. And then obviously there's religious elements to it too. Right?
It's interesting because it reminds me of the idea of dying for the cause. And I remember hearing Judy Garland sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which is now considered more pro-war, but when you sing it in the context of civil rights, it changes how you perceive the life. I mean, trampling out the vintage where the grapes are. So you're actually trying to end racism. You're trying to end indifference, trying to end ignorance, trying to end seeing it as a battle. And perhaps this is what the minister was seeing that. But what you almost ask the question, I'll ask you, when do you die for the cause?
And I haven't been personally in a situation or experience that have pushed, and I guess fortunately pushed me to that point. I imagine there's a point. I imagine we all have a point, right? Because self-immolation is kind of or could be any other form of dying for the cause. Obviously, that's one that has been used. That it's kind of like there's nothing else. Like in the film, the daughter-in-law says he just felt that there was not, he's done everything he could otherwise. And that's the point at where your life is your last protest to really, or for a cause. I mean, I guess people are fighting in Ukraine. That's a form of dying for a certain cause, right? It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, from a religious perspective, I know that because there's the balance of like, when is it suicide, when is it, and that's conversations I've had with other people with the cloth. And yeah, I mean, do you have any perspectives or thoughts on your stance on that?
Well, it's interesting because I remember asked, there's a film, an older film, The Mission, with Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons, which almost asks a similar question, but it's historical fiction. Now, are you familiar with the film?
No, I'm not. No.
I highly recommend it because it's dealing with the Spanish-Portuguese missions of the 1700s. And what happens is you have let me think, I think it's the Spanish coming in, the Brazil-ish area, and the Jesuits established missions. And what happens is, unfortunately, there's a fight between the Spanish and the Portuguese, but it has to do with an argument between the papacy and the Jesuits. And they establish these missions where they essentially they take the indigenous people and they convert them to Christianity and supposedly give them a better life. Yeah. We now have a different lens on that idea of what better life was, so to speak, as if to say living in self-sufficient life in the jungle without the need for Europeans to feed them was not a good life. But I mean, they brought a judgment to that. Living in houses is better than living. Yeah. And
Yeah.
back and forth. So what they did, the story is touching on this idea that they brought the missions, and of course, Portuguese and Spanish get into it, and they give the mission lands, the Spanish mission lands, back to the Portuguese. Then the Jesuit/indigenous people want to fight for their freedom. The Robert De Niro character had been a mercenary. He decides to fight with guns. Jeremy Irons decides to fight with the cross. Okay, so do you do so peacefully, or do you do so with shooting back at your neighbors? Now, I would say the minister did the Jeremy Irons, like the Gandhi, like the passive protest. He did, because he could have, let's face it, he was up to here with racism. He could have gone in fully lock and load, ready to take the town out, right? But he didn't do that. He sacrificed. And I thought, to me, like a Gandhi, or even maybe like a Mrs. Pankhurst. And so at what point do you decide to do that? And ultimately, peaceful protests can make a bigger impact than violent protests, right? As we see.
Yeah.
And certainly Gandhi was a good example of that. And even Martin Luther King, when you had the Black Panthers, on the other side, who wanted a revolution, and Martin Luther King was very much peace. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
or Bonhoeffer in the beginning.
Yes. Oh yeah, what he did in Germany, going back there, was remarkable. I mean, but then he participated in the assassination attempt for Hitler. So Bonhoeffer did. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But the question is, would you do that yourself? I mean, I think some people might say, yeah, bring it on. But that's not a story for another day. Right? But but the question is perhaps, when is violence appropriate, or when is non-violent appropriate? Maybe that's right. I mean, because really what he did to himself was very violent, right?
Yeah, and for everyone who saw it too, that was
yes. So he made an impact that way. And then you took it further and wrote and made this film that stirs people to talk. Right?
Yeah, so now millions of people have seen it secondhand, that experience, not there in person, but have seen it, so were affected by that violence.
Yes.
Well,
just like it took the video footage of George Floyd for people to say no.
Yeah. We see violence every day. We see it on the news, and or about Ukraine, we're seeing violence all the time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Unfortunately, because we get desensitized, and then we need more. It needs to be more intense for us to really. But I thought it was interesting. And I put the quote at the end of the film where Charles Moore's own quote saying that the one thing that really, I'm paraphrasing, pushes people is when innocent people are killed or hurt. That's the one thing that moves people. And it's so true.
Yeah.
It's innocent. There's some, I guess it must be in our DNA of that's not okay.
Maybe it's the maternal, paternal caring for the vulnerable. Yeah. I don't want to hog the mic. I see Gary. Gary, you're on the line. Did you want to ask a question? Maybe not. Okay. Now, Suzanne, did you have a question? I'm sure you're a very deeply thoughtful person. Yes. Susan, just make your way up to the Johnson, make up to the right mic, and you must have you been part of film festivals with your film?
Yeah. I did mostly the American film festival circuit.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think Susan wants to ask a question.
Just, going back to wondering if we're not being desensitized to such things. I mean, this was 2014, and yet we just see so many horrific things online and everywhere. And I'm just wondering, is there, you argue both ways. Does this work? Does this not work? Does it only work temporarily? Is there something that would work to, or is it just going back to just chipping away slowly? You think of water dropping on a rock. If it goes on long enough, hundreds of years, it will erode it away. But the here and now, you can't argue with success, and there are times when violence does work, but then you've got the problem of, do you attack the source and make them a martyr, or do you let them hang themselves? And so I guess what I'm asking is, what's your take on violence as a form of protest?
It seems like at some point, that's what pushes the needle, right? I don't think, or when people protest and end up kind of ransacking their own neighborhoods or this and that, I don't think because people want to destroy the neighborhoods, but it's just kind of the last straw. We need, and so it seems like it is effective to some, not that I'm a scholar in protest or this and that, but it seems like there is forms of it that can offer effectiveness for change. But it also seems like it's a fine line too.
Sort of like
Yeah.
the board when you're losing a game, I guess.
Yeah. And I also think there's, and I was saying this before with Charles Moore, that we can try, it's hard to figure out what the results of your act are going to be. I mean, in all life, right? If I do this, it'll equal this, and therefore, so a lot of times in talking about the film, people apply results, they equate results to value, the value of doing this. So is the value less of that self-immolation of him giving his life if only 10 people saw versus 1,000? Like, does that change the act? The act's the same, but the results are really out of his hands in many ways. So I kind of think now that or even like when we look at, was it Tunisia and the one, I forgot his name, who self-immolated and started, in essence, the Arab Spring. I don't think the individual thought about the Arab Spring in making that choice. I think they were just fed up with the situation in that moment for themselves and their community. And then they did that. And then it started the Arab Spring. And now we look at that as like, wow, this individual sacrificed themselves and started the Arab Spring. I don't think that's what was going on for them in that moment. How could you know that? But they just were living authentically, I'd like to say, to themselves of what they needed to do in that moment. And Charles Moore was doing that. So I try to separate that value, and the results are still TBD. I mean, they're happening now, and we'll see what happens next year and the year after that.
Yeah, did you have a question?
I think Gary would have it.
Hello, Gary. Gary Coates, do you have a question?
Well, I don't have a question, but I have a comment. About 30 years ago, we were visiting my wife's relatives down in Waynesboro, Virginia. And that was the first time I was ever subjected to seeing obvious racism. And it was shown by the cadets from the Virginia Military Institute in their Confederate colored uniforms, walking down the street. And they were trying to approach the few Black people that were in the town. And of course, obviously, the Black people knew what to do to get out of their way. And I said nothing. And when we got back to the house with my cousins, I said, what was that all about? These cousins are not from the South. One is from New England and the other one is a Canadian. They said, well, that's just the way it is. And I guess things really haven't changed. It was a very sad moment. And I asked, I said, there obviously are Black people in the community. Where are they? I haven't seen too many. They said, oh, they live in a different part of town. It's called Dixieland. I thought, oh my God. Anyways, it wasn't a pleasant experience, but I do understand Virginia did not have a great history of accepting anybody that wasn't white. Anyways, I do appreciate your story about the man on fire. I shouldn't say I enjoy it, but it was enlightening to see what one person would do. And it was rather sad to find out he was a Methodist minister. I just think in Canada, I think the closest we have to the Methodist is our United Church, which absorbed the Methodists. John Joseph would be able to clarify that. But thank you very much. I appreciated your comments.
Thank you, Gary.
Thanks.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Gary. And so, yeah, so there's been some great questions, great comments, and part of it would be great to maybe continue the conversation another time too, because I think you have other things you've created and produced. Because I guess the great success of the film is it caused people to think and stop, and not just reflect, but act for change, to make change, and to recognize that change needs to happen now, and not wait on that. And when you think of racism, just because we might say racism has been here a long time doesn't mean it has to stay that way. And it's recognizing that we have the power to change right now. And that's why I think you making films like this is a way to encourage people, not just to see differently, but to act differently and be different. Very good. So I'm going to have Susan pass back over to Susan.
And I just want to add, your film is available on Vimeo, is it?
Yes.
Vimeo. You can check it out there. And so thank you for coming, everyone. And I hope that you can join us next week when our speaker will be Fidel Brief, who will walk us through Passover 2022. I hope you can join us.
Thank you very much.
So thank you, Joel. Fidel and I met on a trip to Israel in 2011. We're still good friends.
Well, would say that again?
Fidel and I met in 2011 on a plane going to a pilgrimage in Israel. We're still good friends.
Nice. Nice. That's great.
Good to see you, Joel, and you're very thought-provoking. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you both. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Bye-bye.